Hi, I'm Elizabeth James Perry, and I'm happy to be here at the Lunenburg High School doing some presentations for students in the school here. I am a traditional artist, and my heritage is Wampanoag from Martha's Vineyard. And I work in a variety of medium, and they include traditional jewelry and quahog called wampum. I also work with a lot of textiles and natural, non-toxic, locally sourced natural dyes. And then I also design maps and various other two-dimensional types of artworks as well.
Museum, please, Lunenburg High School, help me in welcoming Elizabeth James Perry to Lunenburg High School. Thank you very much, Ms. Perry.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Juanita Khan. My name is Elizabeth James Perry, and I'm a member of the Wampanoag tribe. So for those of you who aren't familiar with my tribal community, it's located on Martha's Vineyard. We have a reservation at the cliff end of the island, which is the headland. So we have a gorgeous, commanding view of the ocean, which for folks very concerned with navigation and whaling and fishing and trading is a good place to be even now. I've brought a PowerPoint presentation, and I do quite a bit of photography. So my art practice is pretty diverse. My actual background is academically in marine biology with a concentration in wetland resources and plants. I've done a lot of restoration gardening. And then my dual interest and passion is traditional arts. I'm a Wampanoag person, so my arts are very northeastern woodland and inspiration and materials. And I really came into focusing more closely, I think, on working with the land, with growing indigenous plants from seed, cultivating natural dyes, weaving materials, other sources of art supplies, when I started to range around wanting to get away from mass-produced toxic materials, the yarns that weavers typically use that are imbued with a lot of chemicals that are pretty harsh. And I realized a lot of the plants that Wampanoag people were dependent on are actually becoming pretty rare. So I think fully a third of the plants and trees in this region are actually introduced. They're not from necessarily this continent. And then they're not necessarily serving the same role for other species in the region, and they don't necessarily have an immediate use in terms of our material culture or cuisine and things like that. And so what I started to teach myself was to cultivate some of those things from seed, and learn about different environments in the Massachusetts, Eastern Rhode Island area of our tribal homelands. So I actually live on the mainland. My tribal community's on the island, but I live in Dartmouth, Mass, on the South Coast area. And so I range all around working in the area. There's a sister community of Mashpee in Massachusetts as well that's on the Cape. So we have, relatives between the two communities. There's also Herring Pond, which is a small community that still exists today. And of course, folks live all over, not necessarily strictly on, I just messed up the mic. Tribal lands. Sorry. So here's some photographs of me doing some planting during the pandemic, as you can tell from the mask. And what I sometimes do to kind of share the educational value of this kind of work, I work with other tribal artists who are also interested in growing plants, and also people working in food sovereignty, if any of you are familiar with that. So that's looking at the issue of food insecurity, nutrition, traditional diets versus commercially available diets, and the effect on health and culture. And looking to find places to have community gardens where you can, cultivate the plants that we're dependent on for our nutritional value, and drinks and things like that as well. So what I do is I cultivate both food plants and dye plants, and in this particular slide you can see one of my garden installations that was both educational and also a little bit political. I was kind of creating a garden to be in conversation with the Cyrus Dallin statue. And so, in the Northeast, if you look around, I think throughout the state and throughout the broader New England area, There isn't really a lot of material that's easily accessible, and there isn't a big visual presence of Native people. You know, there's a little bit of information. If you read the newspapers or see the evening news sometimes, there's some usually fairly biased writing in the newspapers about Native people, biased coverage in the media. I think within our tribal communities, we kind of correct that because we use social media all the time. But I think that there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of spreading accurate information and having authentic representation, rather than having material filtered through a lot of very colonized writing and things like that. So these are other garden installations that I've participated in. So I think, you know, foregrounding Native identity, culture, presence. In the previous slide, there was a billboard with photographs of tribal members from the 19th century, and also African American women, because I was partnering with Equa Holmes, who is a really talented collage artist. Here I was working in Franklin Park this year to install a blue shark effigy garden. And so what I try to do with my marine science background, with my coastal tribal identity, is kind of foreground our connection and dependence on the ocean. And so a lot of my gardens have a marine theme, decidedly, and they incorporate different shells and other natural materials from our region. In my exhibit at Double Arrows, I tried to really talk about and get at our relationship with nature. And so the idea of Double Arrows was a two-way connection with the natural world. And there was photography of plants, there was some basketry and weaving. I have some examples here. And then some other work from other artists that I partner with as well. So here's some traditional basketry. When I talked about needing certain materials for my arts, in the Northeast, that would include different types of trees that produce barks that are very serviceable for the arts. Cedar is one of them, both red and white cedar in this region. Basswood bark, poplar bark. So you're using the inner bark, so it takes a lot of processing. It takes a dye very well, so you can get quite creative. And then also things that you can grow on a yearly basis rather quickly, like corn husk, which we'll be working with later today. Different natural dyes that are available on a regular basis. Black walnut is a great one. Sumac berries are, you know, pretty ubiquitous in New England, so really easy to harvest and really easy to use, and they give you a beautiful color. Here's a sense of the color palette that you can get on milkweed, which is a traditional spinning fiber in the Northeast. It's a great pollinator species. We grow it. Don't really use it during the growing season. You just wait till the winter time when it's really easy to peel the stalk, get the fibers, do the processing. So if you're hands-on and you like textiles, it's a gorgeous fiber to work with, and it's very distinctively soft and silken. It's quite pleasant. There's some bags. Can you go back? That's okay. I'm so used to doing it myself. Yeah, I have a certain pace. There are some hand-woven bags with the same natural dye palette. And so what happens when you do the switch from, say, RIT dyes, color out of a bottle, to natural materials is the hues will oftentimes be a little bit more subtle. You can moderate them by adding chalk or iron or copper or vinegar, different other natural materials that you might harvest and mix in. You can make them color fast by using certain of those as mordants. So sumac leaves are great because of the tannic acid. So there's a lot of chemistry in the natural dye process, and it is a good kind of natural connection with my science background because, you know, it's easy to figure out what's going on chemically in a solution. Natural dyes are really interesting too because no two dyes are really identical, and so to some degree, like working with the quahog shell that I use for a lot of my jewelry that some of you might have seen in the case in the hallway there. You know, each set of shells is made by an animal, so each color variation of the purple and white is actually really unique, and it keeps it varied and interesting, and it's a substantial material to work with. And so when I want to do something a little bit more sculptural and less two-dimensional, which a lot of the weaving is, then I work with the quahog shell, and I can kind of satisfy that need to do some three-dimensional creativity for adornment as well as for historical pieces for museums and things like that. You can go to the next slide. So this is just some photography in the beginning, and in this slide I have some photos from Martha's Vineyard, which is where my tribal community is located. It's sort of classic pine barrens, very sandy. You can see lots of lichen. This is where the cranberry bogs, we have wild cranberry bogs still in our tribal community, and making the seasonal rounds to enjoy those harvests is pleasant, but it's also really good nutritionally. So there's lots of antioxidants in the cranberries, as you all probably know. Beach plums are really good for you. That's an earlier harvest. We have wild blueberries, wild strawberries, good things like that as well. And each of them have benefits physiologically. They're also really important ecologically. And so keeping those habitats clean and productive is really important. On the right, almost, sorry. I'm pointing to the slide, I didn't mean to. Yeah, and then, so another thing I do to kind of interest people in Native history as well as Native presence and continuance is producing a map series where I've used a bear basically to symbolize the land. And I think my motivation behind that was push back against what some people will say about the natural world is, it's a bunch of green wallpaper, which I find a little inaccurate, to say the very least. And it doesn't acknowledge our connections with the natural world and our dependence on, minor things like oxygen. And so I decided to portray the land as a bear. So bears in various positions, various sizes, various ages. And for the place names, I've only used Native place names in the language. So in Wampanoag or related Nipmuc or Mohegan languages, Narragansett, Pequot as well. I didn't want to cheat and use English ones as well. I wanted to just foreground our spoken language. We have a language reclamation project, but of course those languages aren't going to flourish again unless we have occasion to use the words if they're understood and appreciated and celebrated as well. And so I've really enjoyed working on the series, and I intend to continue working along that vein for another few years. And then this is, this final slide is another example of placemaking. In my tribal community, we have a lot of tourists come, and folks, there's not a lot of directed tourism, right? People just kind of wander up into the gift shops that we have on the cliffs or the restaurants we have on the cliffs. And for a long time, folks would just show up and say, hey, where are the Indians? Which is, when you're Native, that's an odd question to be getting all the time when you're trying to work or whatever it is. And so folks talked to us in the Tribal Historic Preservation Office and said, well, what can you do for us? And so we came up with a tribal educational kiosk. We wanted to put something on the floor that would be emblematic of where we were. And so we settled on acknowledging Turtle Island, which is very broadly, of course, across North America, our description of the North American continent. It's sort of abstract, but if you look at the overall continent, there actually are sort of, roughly the legs, the head, and the tail of a turtle. And so that's our name for our homelands. And so we decided to encapsulate that in this turtle with a 4-directional symbol on the back, in tiles on the floor. And then I often use Turtle Island in my educational pieces. So this was a painting, a sketch for a painting that I did for a project called Creating Equal that Harvard ART coordinated, where I was able to come together with folks from all different cultures and backgrounds, and we kind of envisioned what the Constitution would look like if in 1776 there actually had been equality, true equality, and a true concern and consideration of the environment instead of just sort of a very commerce, usury attitude, I think, towards our homelands here. And so that was an interesting project. You can check that out online. You can also check out articles about our tribal communities. Some of my garden projects have been covered, and the work continues. I'm working with Emerald Necklace Conservancy right now, and I'm probably going to be leading some plant walks in Franklin Park in the wintertime because they do 0 winter programming, and I think it's such a waste in what's a beautiful area in the city. So I'm looking forward to that. So With that, I'm going to say I have some examples of artwork, and I'm also happy to answer questions either about Wampanoag history or about my career choices, whatever you are curious about, basically.
When did you recognize the moment that your art went from being a passion to being a career?
Yeah, good question. I think that, there was a lot more support in the region, a lot more interest in Native people, culture, and art as I was growing up. Less so, of course, in my mom's generation and in my grandmother's generation. So, they had sort of a different experience than I did. I was very fortunate. I think for me, I've always done the art alongside science, so it was a really comfortable fit for me. But I think that I was really able to focus on culture full-time when my tribe developed a historic preservation office. There were jobs and opportunities. So in terms of what I was doing, I wasn't just covering archaeology and commenting on exhibits. I was also working on cultural experiences for tribal members. I was presenting for the after-school program and having them do activities. I planned a garden of indigenous plants of various kinds, medicine and food, participated in traditional architecture and all. So that was really, it's enriching to be able to focus on culture full-time. That's not necessarily a common experience. And I was able to do that for about a decade. And then I decided to move from that and focus full-time on my art and restorative gardening process. And so I think I'm going to admit I'm someone who likes variety as well. So I kind of make it happen. So, yeah. Different things. And sometimes I use seaweed as an inspiration for the dye colors that I use for the strands that I incorporate into my weaving. This has all wampum tube beads on it, so this is a necklace, and then I make much more substantial, woven cuffs and things like that, and sometimes historic belt reproductions and things as well. This is another piece. This features a crow, local northeastern animals, beings, abstract designs. This is a combination of wampum and garnet. There's a lot, I mentioned use of bark as well as use of plants like milkweed. In this region, we have birch bark, although there's a bit less birch trees due to climate change and infestations and things. This basket's actually from Maine, and I like the artist's sort of contemporary take on traditional inscribed bark decorations, where she inscribed floral designs, but they're sort of very modern looking. And then she dropped pen ink into the designs to kind of make them emergent. A lot of this is sort of a little bit more historic looking, so sort of more true to form for 17th century, 18th century, when materials were still common, and when there were actually a lot more tribal communities. So, I mentioned the 3 Wampanoag communities to you, but, going back in the 18th century, there were 10 tribal villages on Cape Cod. It was only later that folks were forced out and consolidated into places like Aquinnah and Mashpee, and so suddenly you just sort of have these 2 large, basically places of refuge for tribal members, right? When there were multiple communities, you can imagine really thriving commerce and really awesome, community celebrations and feasts and coastal trading and just traveling and getting news and visiting family members and stuff. I would have very much liked that. There's some coil pottery, painted hide. I did bring a book of European collections, because one of the things I had to do when I got serious about wanting to recapture techniques and colors and a lot of other technology, a lot of beautiful Eastern art, material culture, objects went to Europe, either through really early trade, or unfortunately wars of conquest and looting, or sometimes royal gifts, so gifts from leadership here to the Queen of England or France. There's wampum in Russia, that either got traded directly or maybe, the crown or something was trading with Russians, and so there's a beautiful wampum medallion in St. Petersburg. And so this is a painted hide that's inspired by some of the work. that I've seen here, but again, like I said, there's some beautiful examples in Paris and London and things as well in museums. So yeah, please feel free to come and take a look. If you have any questions, happy to answer them. Can everybody hear me without the mic? I hate microphones. Awesome. Okay, so wampum is a word from our language. It describes what we do with the shell. And so this is a really thick shell. It's got a beautiful purple-white contrast, which is kind of unique in nature. There's not a lot of natural purple in solid material. And so it lends itself to being carved into really beautiful purple beads or white beads or a combination thereof. If any of you have done reading about Northeastern Native diplomacy and history, and you've heard about wampum treaty belts, or alliance collars made of wampum, it's sometimes the early colonists were calling it porcelain, or the Jesuits were calling them porcelain or whatever, but what they're talking about is the shell beads that are so important to tribal folks. Later, it sort of became co-opted into this sort of colonial use as currency, because the English, Dutch, French that came here weren't colonizing a place where you had a bunch of silver and copper and gold mines where you could just harvest that metal and mint coins, and they very much had a society based off of money. And so seeing the value that wampum had for Native people, that it could be an item for exchange for goods, that Native people would honor it, whereas silver is a bit abstract if you don't have a cultural need or use or an economic use for it. You can hand it to people all day. They're not necessarily going to value it or seek it out or part with valuable food, medicine, furs, or anything else for it. Wampum was something that we would trade for. And we ended up actually working part of that economy, supplying a lot of the shell beads. And it was, if you can imagine, handmade wampum beads. It's a lot of labor, by the fathom length, so about 6-foot strands of wampum that were being used to buy supplies or pay bills, or, unfortunately, with a lot of intolerance, Native people were being fined for practicing our culture. So it became illegal to plant corn the way we did traditionally, or work on Sundays, even though we weren't Christian and we didn't have a concept of like skipping Sunday, and things like that. So unfortunately, a lot of the wampum ends up, in the 17th and 18th century, you can see it being stripped from tribal communities. So very much what you're seeing now is contemporary artists regaining that technology and those arts, and having some agency, which is really important. Did that answer everything? Cool. Excellent.
So feel free to come on up and look if you'd like.
Sure, please help me in thanking Ms. Perry for coming here today and speaking with us.
Yeah, so this is my wampum jewelry. Some of it is on traditional milkweed, some is on moose hide, as I mentioned, some is on hand-braided linen. This one in the center, that's a harpoon design, is actually on braided buffalo wool. So it's an indigenous fiber, different from sheep's wool. It's quite soft and quite serviceable for different types of traditional weaving, and also modern weaving. Then there are knitters who like buffalo wool these days too, because it's a lovely material and rather abundant in some areas, depending where you live.
Now, where do you get like some materials like that?
Buffalo wool,
Like, do you get it yourself, or is it like somehow sourced?
So my brother and I traveled out to Montana because he won the lottery for the buffalo hunt. So I was able to actually get some while I was out there, and start processing it, and that's where I really developed a taste for it. It's gorgeous, it's unique. The milkweed plants, I have to source the plants myself. I grow them, I process the fiber. These are dyed with different traditional dyes. So there's sumac berry that I used for the red on this particular necklace with a strong contrast. There's bloodroot, which is like, it looks like a reddish root when you dig it, but it actually gives you an orange dye on the one next to it. So this is a 2-ply, the other one is a little bit more ropey, it's 2-ply, but I then braided, so it's a bit thicker. I like the natural dyes because they're non-toxic, they're sustainable, so I know where the materials come from. I pick them and harvest them myself. I know what the health of the plants is. And, you know, like I said, it's non-toxic, so that's, when you're an artist and you want to have a whole career and you don't want to get sick,
Yeah.
it's wonderful if you can kind of minimize any exposure to toxins. So that's what I tried to do. This is porcupine quill work. So this is woven quill work from the actual porcupine animal. These have been dyed with cochineal and black walnut, and then the white is the natural color for the quills. So these are really carefully cleaned and then dyed and then woven. This is my mother, Patricia James Perry's scrimshaw. And so a lot of Wampanoag folk are whaling descendants. You know, so we have different things that we've inherited. My mom actually sources fossilized mammoth for her scrimshaw a lot of the time.
These are small wooden personal looms. These are, you know, better than the cardboard ones because they can be reused. You can take them, or I guess the school is probably reused. I was going to say take them home, but the school might be reusing them, so probably you'll need to leave them here. When I'm setting up my project, I just kind of, depending on what I'm doing, I might take a look at the colors, come up with a concept, and then weave a design. So you can do basically horizontal stripes like this, but you can also get fancy. You could just weave back and forth on the edges with the color. The central portion could be light. Then you could have a geometric design or something abstract in the middle. Hi, how are you? You can just kind of have slender lines or partial lines of multicolors. You could braid multicolors together and then weave the braid. You kind of get my drift here, I'm sure. And then if some of you are weavers, you can do whatever you want, of course. But if you're not as used to it, was that someone actually trying to come in? No. Okay. Probably not. Possibly not? Okay. No. Great. Basically, when I'm starting a weave, this is the warp, these vertical threads here. This is my weft. The weft is a horizontal element. And so when I'm weaving, I'm basically just going, if it's a plain weave, there are many different types of weaves, and we can experiment with those. But I'll start with a plain weave, and it's just over, under, alternating all the way across. And then when I've done that, I'm doing it upside down for you all here. When I've done that, I'll basically just take my material and turn the corner, keep it relatively neat, and then do the opposite on the next row. And when I run out of material, I just overlap a little bit. And so this end will get kind of covered with the new piece that I weave in. And I'll trim anything that sticks out afterwards. You can kind of, on this end, if you have a little bit more of a tail, essentially, you can tuck it under and then worry about either crunching it down so it stays or trimming it after the fact. So this is where I turn the corner, and I'll do the opposite. So where I was going over this thread, I'm going under it, then over the next one because I went under it last time, and so on and so forth. So it'll make sense to you when you've done a couple of rows to kind of get a sense of what it's supposed to look like. And I can walk around with this one after I've done the second row, and you can kind of see what I'm getting at. When I'm weaving, every few rows, I kind of crunch it down a bit to give the warps good coverage, keep the material where it's supposed to be, and just make a denser fabric, essentially. And this is a technique that you could adapt to making a floor mat because corn husk is actually really durable, so people used to do that all the time. Or you can braid it and then sew it in a spiral into a floor mat. And you might have seen at least rag rug versions with, like, you know, recycled cloth as braided rag rugs.
exciting to be here today during Native American Heritage Month in the United States. And it's our great pleasure at Lunenburg High School to have a National Endowment for the Arts Heritage Fellow, Elizabeth James Perry, with us today to help educate us about Wampanoag history and culture and the traditional crafts associated with that culture, as well as projects that we've experienced today in actually making things related to sourcing from the environment. So I want to thank Elizabeth for being with us today. It's very clear that the kids enjoyed themselves, and we're very focused on something unique and different that they don't normally hear in their own curriculum and their own courses. So how does it feel from a Native point of view to be having not a month, but a period of time in which the revitalization of Native American culture and traditions can actually be demonstrated in a classroom with younger people who are going to be the leaders of tomorrow? How does it feel to be able to pass on that very specific knowledge that doesn't always get caught in the standard curriculum?
I think it's a real privilege to be able to work with the youth, both tribal and non-tribal youth. It's a really important age to be able to access and share and open their minds. And I think also it's a privilege because in my youth it wasn't quite as accepted or acceptable, and there wasn't space made for other perspectives and other cultures. And so for me, culture was something that was much more within home or at powwow, but not necessarily in my public school experience.
Right. This is what's so exciting about the diversity of the American population. We're far more multicultural and diverse than we think we are, because there are so many opportunities, fortunately, the 21st century to appreciate cultural diversity, and education and the arts are one of the most powerful ways we have of accessing information that balances the scales, that gives us the other side of the story that was erased, or the story that was hidden, or the story that was only known internally to a culture itself. Particularly when you have so much tribal diversity in the United States. We have almost 600 federally recognized tribes, so it's very exciting to be able to share the very specific knowledge of the Wampanoag culture with students here in the Northeast. Can you speak a little bit about the idea of indigeneity and culture and pride and the empowerment of that?
Yeah, I think so. Northeastern cultures have been so influential to society. There's Wampanoag words incorporated in the English language because they were, folks coming here didn't have words for the new things they're exposed to and new ideas, new cuisines. So clam-baked traditions. There's artistic traditions that come out of Native practices. There's philosophy and even, certain types of tea and pastimes in this area all come out of Native traditions. So we've been enormously influential on how American culture has shaped up, and obviously huge impact on the governmental systems and the sense of democracy, and gradually the equality of women and the idea of kind treatment of children, which are central to Native ways, also became a lot more central to modern living as well. So I think, our impact has always been here, but now I think it's finally being articulated and acknowledged. And there's, more respect, I think, for that. And so I think, it takes us cultivating that appreciation, demonstrating that we're still here, taking care of culture, cultivating culture in the next generation. And also, I think incorporating other perspectives in the educational system so that there is, things have been diversified to the point where there's STEM and STEAM education, and people are understanding that you want to incorporate art and sciences into learning, and that it can't strictly be business or something like that. Likewise, in other cultures, ways of teaching, ways of using creative expression to capture knowledge and to share that. They all have aspects of, chemistry and biology, understanding the seasons, working with different materials and understanding their properties, getting a sense of environmental health because you have to go out on the land to get your materials here. Having that also be part of your celebrations. So we have Cranberry Day in our community on Martha's Vineyard, which brings the families out onto the wild cranberry bogs, and it's a chance for multiple generations to get together. So I think, also bringing together different generations together is something that's a wonderful way to teach as well. So.
One of the things also that you didn't mention but implied is something I think very unique that Native people are bringing to the table of how we solve a lot of the crises on our planet, and that is the sacred and the spiritual and the idea of religion and the centrality of respect for a creator and respect for the representation of all living things in a sacred way. Walking the straight path, becoming a human being. I mean, that whole process of spiritualizing life, it seems, is an important contribution that Native societies are bringing to the table that sort of pushes back against the onrush of capitalism and materialism.
Yeah, you used the word rush in there, and I think that's a big part of it too. So I think they're taking time to understand other aspects of creation, that other forms of life have their lives and have their responsibilities and their contributions. I think that changes things a little bit from a very sort of usury attitude towards the natural world, natural resources. And it's sort of the difference between thinking about resources that I can grab and use perhaps to extinction to kin. I think tribes have been here in the Northeast for so long in our homelands. Appreciating the same landscapes, the same beautiful ocean water and river water and mountains and lovely lush meadows and things. We know our territory really well, and I think that if you hold on to a sense of culture and spirituality, you prioritize that, you make time for that, and so it changes the pace of things. And if there's time to reflect, there's time to relate, there's time to teach the next generation. There's time for someone, my age to think about continuing to learn from my elders, which I continue to do, and I really appreciate that. So it's sort of, priorities are a little bit maybe more balanced if you can hold on to whatever cultural backgrounds, because there's all of those cultures have knowledges that they've built up, those knowledge systems and those ways of relating to things and having a sense of place, right? Here we are on the earth, and many of us live lives that would lead you to believe we're all very isolated people, but we're on an earth that's round, in a globe, breathing the same air together every single day. Every single day the sun comes up, every single day the moon comes up, every night the stars are there. If there's light pollution, perhaps one doesn't get a beautiful view of the Milky Way and whatnot, but they're still there. There's constants and there's company and there's other presences and other ways of looking at things and doing things. So I think, instead of it being huge and somehow daunting, I think we should take sort of a sense of comfort from each other, and take the time to learn whatever we can, and also, just think about safeguarding life, making things as comfortable and as pleasant as possible for the next generations.
Right. Now, in our region, we have a number of different tribes, many of them federally recognized, from the tip of Maine down to the corners of, Massachusetts and Rhode Island and the islands. And this afternoon, we did a project with students on looms using natural organic materials that were sourced and gathered by you for our use. What was your intention in trying to pass on not just the art of looming and weaving with natural materials, but what was the real intentionality behind that from your point of view?
So I don't always take the time to explain every aspect, but I think it's valuable to demonstrate the possibilities of doing things by hand, of sourcing materials that are local, that are sustainable, that you can grow yourself and your property, should you choose. I think this is a good age for folks to think about toxicity and maybe avoiding exposure to harsh chemicals that might be quick, but just because they're quick doesn't mean that they're really ideal for us to put on our body every single day in commercial garments. Also, quick and modern chemical does not equate to better or higher quality. So when you're hand making something, you can do that with care. You can use materials that aren't caustic, so whatever you actually fashion, whether it's a basket or a really nice piece of jewelry or actual clothing that you've dyed yourself from things out of your garden, can last a lot longer with care. It's a different type of production. It's slow art, admittedly, but it's very unique. And I think that the other beauty of natural materials is when you create your materials, you create your dyes, and then you have the variable of all the students with all their different interests and aptitude for experimenting with colors and patterns and things. Every single weaving that I saw in this room was unique. And I think that that is really wonderful for us to remember as well. In the education system, we're dealing with a lot of individual people that all have to find their own path.
Right. One of the things that was very pleasing to me was as I was walking around talking to students, I was getting this meditative vibe. And so I asked, several of them, and before I even got the sentence out, it was, yes, this is very meditative. This is very peaceful. I could see myself doing this. And so it's not a meaningless activity to find that space in yourself where you get a sense of peace from making something handmade in the, the rush of life and the vicissitudes and the ups and downs, to have a way that you can center yourself and an activity that you can use to center yourself. So I think many of them appreciated that aspect of this as well.
Nice, wonderful. Yeah. I think a lot of cultures see ability to practice arts or our traditional cuisines as very grounding. And I think that, that's always a good thing because it just puts you in a better frame of mind to deal with the next situation or the next challenge or, all of the variables that life has to throw at us.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and spending time with our young people. The Board of Selectmen who are funding this project, the Lunenburg Cultural Council that's overseeing it, the staff, I think of the high school as well. Everybody's, I think, appreciating the idea of an artist in residency where you can really expose students to things that they wouldn't otherwise experience again in daily life. And it provides them some, I think, social and spiritual tools to sort of move forward. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Do come back.
Yeah,
Thank
certainly.
you. Thank you.